Hi, hello, I'm Hal. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about all the books that I read in the month of July. I am actually filming this early. There is like another week of July left when I'm filming this, but when I would normally film this video next week, I am going to be on holiday in Sicily, so I thought this was the best idea to just pre-film it, send it out at the normal time, but obviously miss out like the books I'm going to finish next week, which at the moment it looks like that will be 2 books, just based on my normal kind of how much I read every single day. I will talk about those books in next month's reading wrap-up, so that's probably going to be quite a long one at the moment, but that's how it goes sometimes, I guess. So yes, at the moment I have read 7 books so far in July. In terms of like my little stat breakdown, that is 2 physical books, 3 ebooks, and then 2 audiobooks. And I already owned one of those books. I got one of those books from my physical library, and then I got the remaining 5 off of Libby. The first book that I ended up finishing this month was The End and Other Beginnings by Veronica Roth. This is a collection of some short stories, kind of set around moments of change and like endings and beginnings, basically, as the title would suggest. And they're all to varying levels of futuristic. Some of them are more kind of very like modern-ish, but there's like a change in like a technology where the futuristic idea is kind of a bit more explored. Some of them are, I think, set in the same world as like Carve the Mark, which is like one of her like sci-fi books, and are very like futuristic in that way, if that makes sense. I was reading this book and I was listening to this as an audiobook, and I came to the realization that I think I've read most of Veronica Roth's work, apart from obviously her latest published novel, and then I think Poster Girl as well. Everything else I've kind of read, and whilst I like enjoyed like Divergent and Carve the Mark when I read those as a teen, I don't think looking back I would have the same opinion of those now. But I did really enjoy like more of her like novellas that she's been publishing recently, so like When Among Crows in the sequel and The Arch-Conspirator as well. So I was interested in picking this up just as like almost like a bridging, like I believe this has been published in between kind of her writing some of those books and writing some more of her new like adult stuff. And I was just curious kind of in that regard about how I would feel about these stories, and I think how I feel about these stories is very much like with it acting kind of as a bridging. So there's some of the stories in here that I like thought were very simple and very similar to some of the like YA stories that she's written in terms of like the ideas and what's going on in there. And then some of them had really interesting ideas and were actually explored quite well, and I think maybe not quite at the level of some of the books that I've really enjoyed from her, but very interesting little stories. So yeah, I think it's a very much a mixed bag. I would definitely say I think it's like the first couple that I was not very like impressed with, and some of the later ones I was a bit more. But yeah, like I think very much a mixed bag with these. I do think it makes sense in terms of like in the chronology of her books, but unfortunately they didn't all work for me, and I've ended up giving this collection as a whole 2 stars. Just with the range in like quality and my enjoyment of these stories, and just because like at the end of the day I think collectively it's like an okay experience, if that makes sense, which is what my 2-star rating tends to be. The next book that I ended up picking up was Mortal Follies by Alexis. This is the book that I already owned. This is a fantasy, like, Regency romance book. We're set in the 1814, you know, very, very Regency in that way, very similar to, you know, a Jane Austen novel, but there is a level of magic, spirits, multiple gods that are existing in this world in like a magical, like, not in a magical realism way, but just in a like, it's an alternative like world and history kind of way. And yeah, I picked this up from the like communal shelf in the big Tesco's that lives near me That is Naomi, just because I think that the cover is absolutely gorgeous, both this one and there's another one set in the same world with some of the same characters, Compounding Oaths, which I also think is beautiful. But yeah, we're following our main character, who is a young woman called Maylys Mitchellmore, and basically at the beginning of this book, she is facing a series of like events where things keep on going wrong. So like, she's at one, like, a ball to, like, for, like, coming into society, right? And then her dress starts falling apart across her. She goes to a picnic and she is attacked by a swarm of wasps. Kind of things like that, that keep on getting more and more serious. And so, and each time she is being rescued by this other woman called Lady Georgiana Landrake, who is a woman who very recently, like, all of her male family members died quite suddenly, and she has ended up inheriting the dukedom, and she is mired in a lot of suspicion, and, you know, everyone thinks that she might be a witch and things like that. So Maylys ends up having to team up with, like, one of her friends and her cousin, as well as Lady Georgiana, to kind of work out what's going on and solve kind of things going on there, and we kind of go off from there. This was really fun. I think the plot in itself was like weird, because we do find out what's happening to Maylys quite early on, and we do actually manage to fix it, but then there's a second curse that we're trying to fix. And I just wasn't expecting that from the plot summary of this book. It did feel a little bit like we had like two separate climaxes in this book. I felt like the story itself was pretty straightforward. There was a romance as well, and everything kind of was pretty simple in that kind of way. There wasn't anything in the plot itself that was like super intriguing, but what I did really enjoy is the narrative voice that's going on in this book. We are being told this story by a fae spirit called Robin, who has been kicked out of Oberon's court, who was like around in this time, and he is now like in the modern day having to tell stories to earn rent. So you get this wonderful, like, characterful narrative voice where he is making comments around what he's seeing about humans, about whether or not he can, like, involve himself in the various forms that he's, like, being to kind of spy on these people. That was something that I really enjoyed, and I think is similar to kind of the enjoyment that I had from a previous Alexis Hall novel, which was like the narrative voice was quite interesting in this way. Really quite a fun time. I will say, in a very funny way, this is like very slight spoilers. If I had a nickel every time I had a plot that was referencing the goddess Sulis Minerva in the Roman baths as like a real entity that was causing problems, I would have 2 nickels, which is not a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice in the books that I've read recently, you know? So yeah, great time. I ended up giving this 3 stars. Just very solid read, I found. The next book that I ended up picking up was Metal from Heaven by August Clark. This is a fantasy book. We're in like this industrial setting. There's a weird metal that these people are mining called ichorite. It's this very iridescent kind of material. And we're following our main character Marnie, and where this book starts off is that she is something which is called luster touch. Basically, her mother was still working in the factories with this metal when she was pregnant with Marnie, and so Marnie is like sick when she's around this metal. She gets fits, she has like migraine, she's like physically unwell being around this metal. But as we find out later on, she also has the ability to manipulate it. And at the very start of this morning, basically Marnie's family and community, like religious and like work community, end up kind of unionizing and revolting against the owner of the factory that they all work in to try and get better working conditions because of the fate of children like Marnie who are like unwell around this metal. And they all end up getting assassinated, basically, apart from Marnie, who is the only one who survives. And she ends up like, you know, is incredibly traumatized by this event. She has this fixation on like a childhood friend who she, you know, has died in this event, and she ends up escaping and falling into a group of like revolutionaries. Well, we first meet them as like train highwaywomen, but they live in this community out where basically they rose up and got rid of their baron in this like county or something like that. But they can maintain the fiction so they can live in this little like socialist utopia almost. And so Marnie gets brought up here. She gets, she is also now involved in the like train robberies. But things get a bit more complicated when the daughter of the ex-baron is meant to be at an age where she can be going into society and meeting with people. There's a group of like lesbian like socialites and heirs who are like vying for like one of these women's like hand in marriage, and Marnie has to pretend to be this like the Baron's daughter and like join in for like political machinations going on, and things get a lot more complicated from there. This is an incredibly weird book. So when you're reading a book and there's like praise for the book at the beginning of it, and you're reading through and they were all talking about how like weird this book was. To be fair, I was looking at this and going like, yeah, sure, because I've seen people talk about how like weird books are before with things like the Locked Tomb series or stuff like that, and then I've actually read them and been like, okay, well there's like things going on with the narration, or like for example in that one, like all of our narrators don't really know what's going on in the world, so don't explain to us and we have to piece things together. But like as a story, like as a plot, it's not actually that weird. Whereas this one, the writing and the prose in it was weird. It was twisty. I think in a very similar way to how I was imagining the metal in this book. So I think it all worked really well. Just very weird descriptors and very interesting ways at how things were phrased and things like that. And it's also like very much a lesbian book, which I always think is interesting, and I had a good time seeing how some of the concepts that I know about are translated into this like fantastical world. But yeah, I think overall this was like really interesting and really well put together. It's a big story about revenge and about like obviously industry and like industrialization and things like that, and I think it was just done really, really well. Yeah, I had a great time. I think it definitely earns its descriptors of being weird. But yeah, I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think this was really well done. The next book that I picked up was Angel Down by Daniel Kraus. This is the winner of the 2026 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And I'm like not really someone who cares that much about the like fiction, like various literary prizes that happen, because the books that tend to be picked for that are like general fiction or like literary fiction books, and I'm very much like a genre reader, so I don't tend to be interested in the same kind of books that these fiction prizes are like looking at. But when this won, and people started talking about it, I was hearing some interesting things, so such as the fact that it is genre fiction, it is horror, it's doing weird things with its prose, and that also it was set in World War One and there was an angel involved. And all of those words were like, ooh, that does sound interesting to me. In this story, it's set in World War One. We're following a group of like actually American soldiers in World War One, and we're in particular following Private Clive Bagger, who's basically, he's been like a liar and a con man his entire life, and he's using those skills to make sure that he survives in the trenches. He's spending a lot of time like digging graves for bodies and things like that. And basically, at the the beginning of this plot is that him and a group of other kind of outcasts in his battalion get picked to go and find this like shrieker, which is like a man who is dying out in no man's land. So they travel to kind of closer to this like yelling, but when they go over, they realize that it's not in fact a dying man, but an angel who is out in no man's land. And we follow them as they are trying to bring this angel back to their battalion, and things just kind of get worse and worse. The group fractures, but like also just various weird things start happening kind of around this angel. So yeah, like some of the things that happen are incredibly like gooey and gross and horrifying in a really satisfying way in a horror book, you know? In terms of prose, this is kind of written as like one long sentence. You do have, if I show, it is separated into like paragraphs and things like that, but often they are all starting with like and then there's just like commas in between everything, and then it goes to the next one, which I think is really interesting. And there are definitely times when the author is doing things to give a sense of rhythm and changes with using that kind of like method to his writing, if that makes sense. I thought that this was like incredibly well written. I was very much aware in like positive and negative ways that I was reading a book the entire time, if that makes sense. I was very aware in like good ways about like how these words flow together, how these sentences flow together, how when things do change and he's using shorter sentences, or there's a page which is just like a really, really long sentence. You know, all of these like technical writing things, some of the language that's being used in the book I thought was like really interesting and really well done. But at the same time, when he was using some of those techniques, sometimes I felt like I was being a bit separated from this work, because I was like, okay, I get where you're going. Oh, we're still continuing? We're continuing with the really long set of descriptors? Okay, I guess we're continuing. So like in that kind of way, I do also feel like it's very, even though we're doing something interesting with the prose, a lot of this book is written in the same way, if that makes sense. And so like we're only getting a couple of areas where things change, and I think more could have been done with that. I think the story was really well done. There was a point when I was reading this book where I started to get a bit worried, because the angel, which is like in the form of a human woman, was just like very much being treated as an object. But I feel like we do explore that a little bit, and then things, obviously, we learn more about what the angel is doing and why she's here and things like that. So there was a period of time where I was like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this cast of like 5 men and 1 like unconscious woman. So I do have to point that out. I think it's handled like, you know, we do get more interesting things further down the line, but there is a long period of time when that is kind of the status quo, if that makes sense. But yeah, I thought this just was really, really good. I can obviously see technically, on a technical note, how, you know, this got the prize that it got, if that makes sense. I just think that some of the techniques, I think, got to a point where they were slightly overwrought, and I felt a little bit disconnected from the story in comparison to what I tend to want to get from a story, if that makes sense. But, so yeah, I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think it was incredibly solid and really well done, but I'm nitpicking, which I'm allowed to do, even if I'm not, like, you know, a literary critic or whatever. The next book that I ended up finishing was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. This is a non-fiction book. It kind of starts from the seed of our author, Naomi Klein, who is a variety of other books, mainly around, you know, climate change, like capitalism and larger kind of forces of power on an authority on our landscape, continuing to being mistaken for Naomi Wolf, who is another author who has previously wrote things like The Beauty Myth, but especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, started to get more and more right-wing and kind of radicalized by some of the COVID conspiracy theories that were happening, and kind of originated some of those as well around vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and things like that. And so we're kind of using that as a jumping off point to explore more of the political and like social kind of changes that occurred during the pandemic, and making some greater points around the change in politics around things like climate change and settler colonialism and, you know, the ways in which government overreach is happening and things like that. And at all of these points, kind of returning back to this idea of doppelgangers and shadow selves and things like that. I think this was really good. I think she does a really good job of using this central idea of doppelgangers to tie together all the things that she's talking about that make this feel like a really coherent narrative instead of what it could be, which, because she is discussing a lot of things that on the face of them feel quite disparate, but she does a really good job at tying all of these things together, and I think it's done really, really well. I think she does a really good job at both explaining these things to people who might not know a huge amount, but also like not shying away from some of the details or some of the like more difficult topics that she's talking about. I think she does a great job of like not only criticizing things other than her, so like political movements and people that she doesn't agree with, but also turning some of that criticism to her own kind of like activism or like movement that she's been a part of, and her own kind of thought patterns in a way that I think is, you know, really interesting and definitely kind of brings a balance to some of the things that she's talking about. It's not like, this is really good, but you're not having a fun time reading it, if that makes sense, just because a lot of the time it's so depressing about the state of like climate change and things like that. The rise of like diagonalism and the far right and etc, you know? I do think that there are a couple of things that like I did have a tiny bit of an issue with. So in that kind of way of like that criticism and turning it against like, you know, her own political ideas, she does make an offhand comment of being like, maybe we were like too quick to like let go of the lab leak theory. A comment which I believe prompted an hour and 20 minutes if books could kill bonus episode about the lab leak theory and how there is absolutely no evidence to support this at all. So, like, I do think that was a mistake. I can't remember exactly what the evidence was like in 2024, but I do think that was a mistake, unfortunately. And then as well, as with any book that is kind of reflective on personal experiences and talking about things that are specific to the areas of the world that someone has lived in, I did feel like this was quite specific to the time that she was writing this book in 2024, and quite specifically focused on the US and Canada, although we do go to other places as well. But yeah, I felt like sometimes she was discussing things and it's like, this does not relate to my own personal experience of this event, but I do think it's important that you're bringing this up for your like target audience, which is, you know, likely the people who are in the US and Canada, if that makes sense. I feel like that is a criticism that can be levied at a lot of like non-fiction books in this kind of vein. I think it's often that thing of like, is it trying to be very specific about something or is it trying to be very general? But in being general, it's only basing itself off of like XYZ. And I think this does toe a good line between those two kind of ideas. But there were just a couple of times where I was like, this is not useful, and I do think this should be generalized in the way that it could be taken by someone listening to this. But overall, like, very, very good. A lot of things to think about and reflect on and like really like chew on in that, if that makes sense. So yeah, I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think it's always difficult to rate non-fiction books, but yeah, I think that's where I fall. The next book that I ended up picking up was A Long and Speaking Silence by Nghi. This is the latest book in the Singing Hills cycle, which are a series of short novellas following Nghi and their Nexin, Absolute Brilliance from the Singing Hills Monastery, as they go out into the world and are collecting stories, basically, and helping people along the way. The whole time that I've been reading these novellas, they're very much like, these are all like interconnected stories, they can be read out of order. This is the first one that I feel like timeline-wise is a bit different to everything else, because this is set earlier in the timeline. This is set as Nghi is like, has just become a cleric from being a novice, and they're being sent out on their like first mission kind of thing. I don't know if they're missions, but like on their first journey, and they've come across this city, and they're not doing a great job. Their wallet has been stolen, so they're having to work as a waiter for tips. The city that they're staying in is having a bunch of refugees from another place coming in, and that's causing some issues that they're like trying to help with, but also kind of causing problems because they are not the experienced cleric that we have come to like know them as, if that makes sense. And kind of obviously, as you would imagine, things go from there. It is quite short. I did think that this felt a little bit disjointed in a little way. We're following a couple of like disparate ideas, and a couple of them like reach their conclusion, but some of them just don't. Some of them just kind of get left, and we never get like a satisfying conclusion about like the idea of what's happening with these people, which like makes sense in terms of like the size of this story. But it didn't feel like it had a really strong through line like a lot of the previous books have had. However, I did think the ideas that were being explored were interesting, and the end of this book really like got to me and made me tear up in a real way. So like I think there are like very good like pearls in this book. It just was a bit weird, if that makes sense. So yeah, I ended up giving this 3 stars in the end. I do think this is like a lower 3 stars. I think if I didn't love how this ended and feel like the ending was so emotionally strong, I don't think I would have given this a 2 star, I think. But it was very strong in its ending, which made up for, I think, some of how disjointed it felt. But I do think that was a real problem that I had with this book. And then the last book that I finished so far this month was The Girl with a Thousand Faces by Sunyi Dean. This is a like fantasy horror in the way of like a ghost story book. We're following our main character, Chenmei Chi, or Mercy Chan, as she later on this book ends up referring to herself as, who we start off with her as Mercy, as this like middle-aged ghost kind of medium, someone who can talk to ghosts, as she is working as part of like almost like a gang, one of the triad gangs in the walled city of Kowloon in Hong Kong. And we kind of start off with her like at a normal day of work, following kind of what her life looks like as she deals with one of the ghosts that she's kind of been sent to deal with, and then ends up dealing with some like weird things going on, these weird stronger ghosts that keep on like wanting to give her a message. She runs into like an old friend. There are a group of politicians that are wanting to tear down Kowloon and like being involved in that as well. And yeah, and then we're also getting kind of throughout the beginning of this book kind of some of her history as well. So she does not remember her life before washing up on the shores of Hong Kong with this weird lightning scar with her name like inscribed into her arm as a young girl during the Japanese occupation. And so she has very much like had to make this life for herself so that she is now comfortable as this older woman. Yeah, and then like we change perspective. We go back in time. We find out exactly the events that led up to Mercy being in the situation that she was in when her memory starts, and kind of how the past and like the choices that various characters made affect each other and have led to the people that they now are and the actions that are kind of going on later in this story. It is very much looking at the ideas of like trauma and grief and forgiveness and how these affect, the people involved in that story, and kind of where do you go kind of thing. We're playing with elements of like Chinese religion, folklore and mythology, with some of the goddesses and like ghosts and types of spirits that we encounter in this book. There's some interesting things with points of view and third person, second person, etc., and like who is narrating the story and things like that, and which I think were done really well. And yeah, I just like loved that we got to see so much of like the people that are involved in this story, and we got to experience like both sides almost of this story and how it all ended up. I definitely cried my way through this ending. I thought that it was incredibly emotional and like well thought out and done just so well. I'd read Sunyi Dean's previous work, The Book Eaters, but I just think that this one was so much better and just so much more up my alley and had this like emotional aspect to it that really, really gripped me. Again, I also enjoyed that our main character, who we follow for like, you know, a lot of this book, is an older woman as well. And yeah, I just thought that this was like so well done and is such like an interesting and a love letter to like Hong Kong and Kowloon and these aspects that we're playing with in such a like interesting way. I definitely like already like was on a pretty good basis when I go into a lot of these books just with my previous interest in like the Untamed and everything that came as a part of that, but learning a bit more about this like different ethnic minority within China was really interesting. You know, China and Hong Kong, I guess. Like, my only criticism about this book, which might not even be a criticism about the book itself, if that makes sense, was that the copy that I was reading, which was like an ebook on via my library, had an issue where there would be words that were missing letters. So instead of saying like hate, it would be like hat. And this was multiple times throughout this book, and I feel like it got worse the closer I got to the ending as well. And it was enough that I've obviously picked up on it, and it did break my immersion every time that I came across one of these words, unfortunately. But like, I do think that the story is incredibly solid. At the moment, I've given this 4 stars. It's really difficult. I do think it's the best, I mean, it's the most recent book that I've read this month. But in terms of things that have like affected me emotionally, probably the best one that I've read this month. I'm very much like, I'm going to see how it plays out and if this sticks with me and if that rating needs to be changed, if that makes sense. In terms of what I'm reading at the moment, I am listening to The Second Sight of Zachary Cloudsley by Sean Lusk as an audiobook, and then I have also just started If on a Winter Night, A Traveller by Italo Calvino, which are the 2 books that I'm hoping to finish by the end of July, and then I have some plans for the beginning of August when I'm on holiday as well. So yeah, this is not everything that I read in July, but this is everything that I've read so far. I hope that you've also had a good reading month. I hope that you're having a good day. Bye!